So good evening and happy Chinese New Year. And thank you all for coming. I'm Luigi Zingales. I'm the faculty director of the Stigler Center, and I'm very happy to host tonight Carey Gillam for a conversation with Bethany McLean on her book Whitewash, the story of a weed killer, cancer, and the corruption of science. Thank you both for joining us and discuss this very interesting and important topic. Carey's book is available for sale in the back, and she will sign copies at the end of the program. Before we start, please note that we are on the record live streaming. So number one, silence your phones, and remember that what you're saying will be there forever. As usual, the views expressed by our guests are their own, so they don't represent those of the Stigler Center, let alone one of the University of Chicago. As you know, the Stigler Center promotes and diffuses research on regulatory capture and the various distortions that special interests impose on capitalism. We have many initiatives, including the Capitalism podcast that I co-host with Kate Waldock. And please check it out and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast. And please visit our website for more information on all the things we do. And coming up at the beginning of March, there will be an interview actually with Raghu Rajam and his new book. So tonight, we look forward to an insightful conversation. But before we start, allow me briefly to introduce our speakers. So Carey is a veteran journalist, researcher, and writer with more than 25 years' experience. She started very, very young, covering corporate news, including 17 years as a senior correspondent for Reuters. She has specialized in biotech crop technology and associated pesticides development, along with the regulatory issues surrounding both. She now works as a freelance writer and researcher on food and chemical policy issues and directs a research for non-for-profit consumer group called US Right to Know. Carey has won several industry awards for her work and has been recognized as one of the top journalists in the country covering food and agriculture. Bethany is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and a contributing at CNBC. She was previously an editor-at-large at Fortune, and before that, an investment analyst at Goldman Sachs. She is an investigative journalist known for her work in exposing the Enron scandal and also in analyzing the 2008 financial crisis. And she co-authored several bestsellers. Her latest book is Saudi America, The Truth About Fracking and How It's Changed the World. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you all for being here. Carey, welcome to Chicago. Weather better or worse than Kansas?
About the same, yeah.
So I wanted to start by asking a little bit about you. You said that you were dismayed when you were first put on the ag beat. Tell us a little bit about your work before that and about what your reaction was at first to covering this industry.
Right. So I covered the banking industry before I moved into covering food and agriculture. And I was living in Atlanta and writing about big banks and spending a lot of time in blue business suits and high heels, and I thought that was, the most important industry, in high finance and these big wheeling and dealing banks. And then Reuters said, you know what, we want you to move to Kansas and start covering food and agriculture. And I thought, oh my gosh.
A very exciting transition.
That is a terrible idea. But, made the move, had some family considerations in Kansas City, and I just had my first child, and it seemed like a really good idea. And, wow, did I learn what I didn't know? And, I've come, and I write in my book, I think that I've come to firmly believe that farming, that agriculture and production of the food that we eat is the very most important pursuit, because, of course, we all eat. It is necessary for our survival.
And was there a moment that hooked you, or a moment that you knew there was a book in this?
Oh, people ask me that. And, I wrote the book, I started the book in 2016, and, I started writing and learning about food and ag and writing about food and ag in 1998. So this was, 20 years of research and knowledge that I had developed. the publisher, frankly, the publisher came to me while I was still at Reuters and said, you know what, you're writing a lot about these issues that seem really important and interesting. Could you do a book? And I said, good God, no. No one's going to want to read a book about this stuff, about pesticides, for crying out loud. And they convinced me that maybe somebody would read the book. And so, I left Reuters at the end of 2015, took this job with this nonprofit doing research on food policy matters, and started writing the book. And
here we are.
Here we are.
So before we get to glyphosate, and I'm still working on my pronunciations, I want to set the stage with chlorpyrifos.
Can you
so
spell it?
What is it? I can spell it, I just can't pronounce it. So what is it and how widely is it used?
So chlorpyrifos is an insecticide that makes a lot of money for Dow Chemical, and it's been used in food production and very widely used. Not so much necessarily as glyphosate, but a very popular chemical in the FDA report where it tracks residues of pesticides in foods. This most recent year, it was the 11th most prevalent pesticide found in our food by the FDA. And the year prior, it was the 4th most prevalent pesticide. Unfortunately, it has been found to be neurodevelopmentally damaging to children who are exposed to it. There's pretty much a scientific consensus about how damaging and how harmful this is to young children. So it's been banned from household use, and it was supposed to be banned from agricultural use in 2017. The Obama administration and the EPA had that ban planned. Trump administration came in, Dow Chemical sat down, contributed $1 million to the Trump inaugural fund, and the ban went away. So we now are in a somewhat odd position where our EPA, if you go on the EPA website, if it's up and running, and you look at dietary exposure for chlorpyrifos, you'll see that the EPA says that while we once told you it was safe in food and water, we now are telling you we can't say there's any safe level in food and water. And yet the FDA is saying, look how prevalent it is in our food. So
I found that it was in a piece that you wrote recently, I think, and I found that just a very scary and illuminating 3 facts coexisting side by side. The EPA said it was safe. The EPA changed its mind and said it's not safe at any level, and yet it's still in our food. Does that set the stage for glyphosate?
Yeah, I mean, it does to a certain extent. The book and the work I do, there's so many things going on, but the bottom line of my work, what I've come to understand and be quite fearful about, is that modern agricultural practices that have been driven and perpetuated by a handful of very powerful corporations have left us with a pesticide-dependent food production system in which farmers have been sort of trained to rely really heavily on insecticides and herbicides and fungicides, and especially herbicide use we've seen increase dramatically over the last 20-some years. And we're finding, and glyphosate is the most widely used, so it's the very best example, I think, and it's the example I carry and track in my book, but it's so prevalent. It's ubiquitous. It's found in rainfall. It's found in air samples. It's found in surface waters. It's found in our own bodies quite commonly in urine samples.
So back up a little bit. When it was discovered or created, they called it a 1 in a 100-year discovery that's as important for reliable global food production as penicillin is for battling disease. Why was it supposed to be such a marvel, and what made it into such a bestseller?
So Monsanto invented this or found this herbicidal use for this molecule, this chemical we call glyphosate, and you probably know it better as Roundup. It's the active ingredient in Roundup products and then hundreds of other herbicide products really around the world. But when Monsanto brought it to market, it was heralded as just a very important discovery for agriculture in particular. And it's true, it was much safer than many other herbicides that farmers had been using. There's an herbicide out there that farmers use called paraquat, if anyone's familiar with that, and it's known that if you get a little bit, if you somehow splash some up on your face and you get it into your mouth and you consume it, you're probably going to die within the next couple of weeks. I mean, that's just what happens with paraquat. So you compare glyphosate, and it
sounds pretty good.
It's pretty good, and it was also really, really effective. very efficient and killed
And easy to use, right?
killed plants in a very novel way, and it was considered quite remarkable. And
so how is it linked to and different than GMOs? Because its use is concurrent with GMOs, right? But yet it's different. So explain that relationship.
Yeah, it's linked quite a bit. So Monsanto introduced this in 1974, which is a decade or so before it introduced genetically engineered crops, and it was actually Monsanto's patent was expiring on glyphosate. And it came up with this brilliant idea to introduce these new genetically altered seeds that had traits engineered into them from other species, transgenic. And these traits would allow these plants to withstand being sprayed with this herbicide. So that Monsanto said, we'll call them Roundup ready crops. We'll sell these genetically altered seeds that are patented, that we license them and people have to pay us every year. And we'll also make all this money because people will use Roundup with them, and we won't lose market share with this patent expiring. And they introduced soy and corn and then sugar beets and canola and cotton and all of these crops they call Roundup Ready. So GMO crops are quite separate, obviously, and there are now other types of traits. There's insect-resistant traits and sort of an array of different things. But still today, 20 years ago and today, the most prevalent, the most planted and most cultivated is the herbicide tolerance. Yep. And what we've seen happen is about 40 million pounds a year in the US of glyphosate was used in the 90s. Right now we use about 300 million pounds of glyphosate in the US. So,
those
and we're
are
up,
stunning figures.
Yeah, and it's worldwide. It was 124 million pounds or so 20 years ago. It's 2 billion pounds now. So.
Right. And without the growth in GMOs, that use wouldn't have grown.
Much of that
extent
is attributed to the rise of genetically engineered crops, which encourage the use of this glyphosate pesticide.
So at one point you write in your book that Monsanto promised that herbicide, pesticide use was actually going to go down. Do you think they ever believed that?
No, it is true. I mean, there's so many different things. You can't lump all GMOs together. You can't lump all pesticides together. It's true that insecticide use declined a bit because of the introduction of insect-resistant genetically altered crops. So farmers wouldn't have to spray certain types of insecticides that they had sprayed before because the plant itself became toxic to the insects that were damaging. Which, some people are worried about that for a whole lot of different reasons, because of course we're consuming the plant. But with herbicide use, there's really no question about it. I mean, some uses of, some paraquat went down, but glyphosate use more than made up for that.
So let's turn to the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. They're supposed to be in charge of setting limits about how much of these chemicals we're supposed to be able to tolerate, which in and of itself is an interesting idea, right? But how does that process actually work in reality? How much influence do corporations have over how that limit is arrived at?
Yeah, this is a subject, it's so nerdy, isn't it? Like, it's just...
I like nerdy. It's all good.
This is a nerdy group, maybe, considering the setting. So... I hope that's taken as a compliment.
It is a huge compliment.
So pesticides in our foods, according to the companies that sell them and the regulators and all, that's expected. Like, you shouldn't be surprised at that. You shouldn't be surprised that the FDA says roughly 80% of our fruits carry pesticide residues and 50% of our vegetables carry pesticide. That you shouldn't be surprised that a bowl of strawberries could have residues from 20 different pesticides in them. It's all fine, don't worry about it. This is what they tell us. And what happens is when the company wants to sell, Monsanto or Dow or whomever, when they want to sell these pesticides and certain uses to farmers, and they understand and know that there's going to be residues left in the finished food, they go to the EPA and they say, here's what we need. We need a legal level, a legal amount that will be set at, here. And they will request this tolerance. They call them MRLs, or tolerance, from the EPA. And the EPA will then say yes or no and do analysis and everything. And so those are considered to be safe levels that are protective of human health when we consume them. But the interesting thing is that, of course, the companies then come back sometimes, year after year after year, and say, could that safe level get a little bit higher? Could we do a little bit more so we could have ever more and more pesticides, and it will be considered legal in our food.
And that's happened with glyphosate, right?
Oh, multiple times, multiple times. And we are now, there's a wonderful database operated by an organization that keeps track of all of the tolerance levels in all the countries in the world for crops, and we top the charts.
And why is that?
allowed the most.
Why is the tolerance so much higher in the U.S.
Because
than
we're
around
so
the
much
world?
healthier in the U.S. and we can handle more pesticide residues in our foods, I think, much more than those weak Europeans, because they have much lower levels that are allowed. You know, I make the case in my book, it's due to corporate influence and corporate power and corporate capture of our regulatory bodies.
So right around the same time, as the glyphosate levels are rising, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, says in 2014 that both the FDA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture should start regularly testing foods for glyphosate. You write that glyphosate stands as the one key pesticide that regulators do not look for. Can you explain that? How do they not even look for it? If we're supposed to know what a tolerance level is, how can it be that they're not even looking?
That's exactly what I keep asking the FDA and the USDA. No, so there's a nifty little clause in the law that EPA, you know, applies to EPA, that says after they set these tolerances, within 5 years, they should look at data that's gathered by our FDA and USDA to make sure that the levels that are in the food are within these legal levels that were set. And so every year, our USDA and FDA test hundreds, thousands of food samples, and they look for hundreds of different pesticides. And they have never, in 30-some years, looked for glyphosate. Now, I say that with a caveat. In 2014, as you said, the Government Accountability Office said, what the heck? And I had been writing about this, what the heck, why not? And for years, and USDA and FDA would always say, you know what, it's really safe, there's no reason to worry about it, we're really busy, you know, it costs a lot of money to test, that sort of thing. But they did, then after the scrutiny from GAO, USDA did say they would test, well, they didn't say it publicly, but I found out in a Freedom of Information report request. They were supposed to start April 1st, 2017. I was all ready to see what they were going to find, and then they killed the program. The FDA did, in fact, start testing in 2016, looking for the first time for glyphosate residues in foods. Very, very limited look. And I write about this in the book, and so you know about it, but one chemist, a senior level chemist in the FDA, pulled some honey from store shelves, pulled oatmeal samples from store shelves, baby food oatmeal, and started testing and found really worrisome levels of glyphosate in all the honey and in this baby oatmeal, and went to the supervisors at FDA and presented them with this information. And what happened is he was removed from any further pesticide residue testing. And they never reported this to the public. None of that was ever reported to the public. It's only knowable because of Freedom of Information Act requests.
Talk a little bit more about the punishment that you saw be inflicted on people who spoke up against, or who have publicly worried about the risks.
Oh my gosh, it's so pervasive. And I'm sure, you know, as a reporter, you've encountered this too, and you always encounter people when you're talking about controversial subjects who are a little bit worried about going public. But in this industry, on these topics, we've seen just over and over people within the EPA, people within the FDA, people within the USDA, our government scientists, people who are supposed to be working on our behalf. And they're finding things, they're doing research, and over and over again, you know, what you hear, what you learn, sometimes secretly because they don't want to say it out loud, sometimes through documents, and sometimes they do come out and try to speak out, is that their work is suppressed and they get harassed and funding is cut to their program. Sometimes they lose their jobs. I have examples of all of that in my book, and it's just so disheartening. There's one email that just always sits with me from the 80s from an EPA toxicologist writing to Monsanto because he had been looking at studies and finding problems with glyphosate, and Monsanto was telling him he was wrong, and he was saying he wasn't, and they were going back and forth, and he said, it's not my job to protect corporate interests. It's my job to protect the public. And so the guys in the middle get it, the working scientists get it, but the political appointees and the management at these higher levels in our regulatory bodies are, the evidence is overwhelming of the influence and the cozy relationships with corporate America.
And talk about that. Is the EPA able to fight back? Are scientists able to do good work, or is the relationship and the revolving door with industry just too close, let alone for comfort, but for honesty?
So you see examples where we had a recent example with the EPA. Well, and this one, what I told you about, scientists who are trying to do work and protect the public, but they get shut down over and over again. We do have an example recently of the EPA wanting to do some testing in conjunction with the National Toxicology Program of this chemical glyphosate and glyphosate formulations, and the industry didn't want anything. They wrote basically, "How dare you?" to the EPA. I mean, we have the letters. What are you thinking of? If you need that data, we'll give it to you. You don't need to go looking outside. And the EPA said, no, we're gonna do it, and they are doing it. So, but then you have another example of the same lobbying group that told them to kick a scientist off, a scientific advisory panel because they didn't think he'd be favorable to industry, and the EPA did it.
Right.
So.
Right. You write in the book, this was a really interesting couple of sentences. Sure, PR is an old game, but Big Ag is giving the age-old techniques of shaping public opinion in a new, sneakier spin. Much of today's marketing happens behind the scenes and off the printed page, on the web pages of blogs, on Twitter feeds and Facebook pages, through sponsored content and industry-funded webisodes, and on the stages of big ideas festivals. And you quoted a woman named Annie Laprie actually saying that. It strikes me that this is an issue, it's a Big Ag issue, but it's also an issue that goes well beyond Big Ag. How do we combat that?
Yeah.
You laugh.
Maybe somebody here can figure that out. Obviously awareness, education, information awareness. I think it's important just to be aware that things you might read on WebMD, for instance, or different, the American Council for Science and Health. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Like a consumer, motivated, consumer protection motivated group. What are some others? Academics Review, these different groups that sound like they're independent and that they're looking at science independently and they're weighing in. You see a lot of things from American Council on Science and Health written and published in USA Today, for instance. You've seen things in Forbes magazine, again, WebMD, their dietitian websites, and what I've seen in the internal Monsanto documents is how they've created all of these. And they don't want anybody to know they're behind it, because the messaging that they want to get out there is they want it to appear as though it's coming from third parties, independent organizations and entities that aren't tied to Monsanto but are pushing Monsanto's message. And they are doing that across the globe in multiple ways, multiple media outlets.
I thought as I read your book, it was like Russian nesting dolls with an organization hidden inside an organization, hidden inside another organization. And I think that's often true broadly in the world today. And you have to keep looking and peeling back the layers of what's actually inside
it's so covert and so deceitful and deceptive. And it's designed to deceive consumers and lawmakers, farmers, regulators. Others. And then there are others who are in on it and who are collaborating. And it all sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, but the documents don't lie. We have the internal documents from EPA, FDA, USDA, Monsanto, their lobbyists, the scientists that they are paying to have their names on papers that Monsanto's actually writing.
And you'd wonder why it has to be hidden. And you did, Carey, unearth an amazing trove of documents showing the emphasis on secrecy and on not knowing that the money at the end of the day is coming from Monsanto and making sure that it's hidden. And you always have to wonder when there's such emphasis on secrecy and on something being hidden, what's there to hide?
Well, that's the point. They say their particular product is so safe, it's so safe, it's so safe, it's so safe. It's like, well, then why would you have the need to go to all of these lengths to control but that's another question.
So there's this big moment in March 2015 when this team of World Health Organization cancer experts, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, announced that they decided glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen. Tell us about that moment and how pivotal it was.
Write a whole book about it. Right, so yeah, this was in late March 20th, I think March 20th, 2015. This had been coming. I mean, those of us who were following it could see this because as the use of this chemical expanded so dramatically, scientists, of course, around the world started looking at its impacts on human health and on the environment. And so the science started to build, and a lot of the science was alarming. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, added it to its list of substances to evaluate. And they did this, and they came together. This was a group of international scientists who are independent, come from around the world, different governmental organizations or academic, and they looked at the literature related to this chemical, glyphosate, published peer-reviewed epidemiology and toxicology and mechanistic data, and weighed it all and came up with and said the weight of evidence indicates it's a probable human carcinogen. Not definitively, not possibly, but a 2A, and that's what, and that was it. They didn't say anything else, but Monsanto lost its mind and set about doing everything it could to discredit these scientists. And interestingly, you see in the internal documents that before IARC even met, Monsanto was worried about it, and they talk about how worried they are. And they talk about that they even knew what kind of rating they were going to get. They talked about it's probably going to get a possible or a probable human carcinogen rating. And they laid out, even before IARC met, they laid out how they were going to go after IARC and discredit them, which I just find amazing. And then they did it.
So Monsanto says it has more than 800 studies demonstrating the safety of glyphosate, that regulators agree with it, that other countries also agree with it, but yet the company won't make its own studies available for public scrutiny. They say they're trade secrets. How does that work?
Right, so the regulatory studies don't have to be published, they don't have to be peer-reviewed. These are different studies that our regulators require, that EPA requires for Monsanto to, feeding studies and what does it do to your eyes, and what, there are tests on rabbits and dogs and mice and rats and all sorts of things that companies are required to do, to give to the EPA, and so they do them, and they do them themselves, or they pay other other scientific organizations to do them, and then they present them to the regulators. And so that's how our system goes. And it seems, a lot of people say, good grief, this is Fox in the hen house. Why are our regulators relying on unpublished studies that are done by these companies? And
that aren't subject to peer review.
That aren't subject to peer review and aren't published anywhere, so no one can review them. And what analysis has found, because you can get like the conclusions, you can sort of see what the conclusions were, but you can't look at the data. And analysis has found that overwhelmingly, if the work is done by the companies or on behalf or funded by the companies, no matter if it's Monsanto, whoever it is, most of them say the product is safe. If they're done by so in the case of glyphosate, IARC looked at studies that were mostly done by outside scientists, and most of those found problems. EPA mostly looked at studies done by Monsanto, and most of those found no problems.
How surprising.
So
but the dividing line is that sharp.
That's why there's
really
a differentiation, why this World Cancer Group says it's a probable carcinogen and our EPA says it's not.
You're actually, contrary to some of the negative reviews of your book, you're actually quite nuanced on this issue. You're not sure that glyphosate does cause cancer. You write, but the question of exactly how dangerous long-term use of glyphosate might be, especially in formulations such as Roundup, has thus far been hard to answer. What does your gut tell you about this?
Well, first I have to say, I've only seen one negative review. Have you seen more than one?
I've had people have approached me on Twitter when they found out
Oh,
I
well,
was
yeah,
doing
but
this
those
and said it doesn't cause cancer.
Because
and so, but
every- I just have to say, I have to do-
but you don't actually say that, which I think
I don't
is
say
interesting.
that.
You're actually quite nuanced on a topic
I
that
am.
when people want to dismiss work, they'll often put words in your mouth, right? And I think you are quite nuanced on a subject that is a difficult one.
Yeah, I mean, the book is not out to prove glyphosate causes cancer. The book, you know, and the point I've made, if we get rid of glyphosate and Monsanto tomorrow, we haven't solved the problem. We have created, or we've allowed corporations to create, as I said earlier, a pesticide-dependent food system that is rewarding these companies with billions of dollars in profits, but is leaving not only human health problems, but environmental problems. And I lay all of those out in detail in the science behind it in the book. And it's not just cancer, it's reproductive issues, bad birth outcomes, neurodevelopmental problems, you know, related to autism and attention deficit, and you know, digestive issues, and some things like that. So, you know, these are important issues, and what I'm trying to call for is a level playing field where the companies tell us all about the rewards. We got that covered. But I think we need more transparency and truthfulness about the risks. And that's the point of the book. And just to get back to that negative review, because I think it's a good anecdote, the only negative review that I've seen that is out there was written by and published by BioFortified. And BioFortified is listed in the internal Monsanto documents as a very helpful partner. So all of the independent reviews have been quite positive.
That's par for the course, right? So moving on from cancer, another part of this I found really troubling is that in the end, it's not clear that glyphosate actually works. And what I mean by that is that I knew about superbugs. We all know about superbugs, but I did not know about superweeds. So explain superweeds and what you thought when you first encountered them, and what they tell us about the larger picture too.
Yeah, so way back, so in the early 2000s or so right after Monsanto introduced, well, when they introduced these herbicide-tolerant crops, a lot of scientists, weed scientists, there is such a thing as a weed scientist, and
lots of them actually in different formats.
Right, and agronomy experts said this is a really bad idea, because if you are just going to be spraying this stuff, you know, during the growing season and right on this stuff over and over and over again, and because we also, the other aspect of this was it encouraged sort of monocropping, where farmers got rid of crop rotation and things that they used to do to help prevent, you know, weed problems. Got rid of all of that, so we have monocropping, so you're just using this over and over, and weeds became resistant, and the scientists warned that it would, which is a really bad thing. And Monsanto said, it's not going to happen, don't worry about it. And about 2011, 2012, they said, oh gosh, we have millions of acres of farmland now with weeds that don't die if you spray stuff on them.
And pause on that and talk about what these weeds look like, and a weed that won't die.
Right, so yeah, you think about a little weed in your yard, but I mean, in some farm fields, some types of these weeds can get as tall as a person, and they can get, you know, as big around as a little sapling. And farmers in cotton country in the South were having to hire people to come in and hand weed their fields, and it was, you know, some of the estimates in production loss and added costs were over $1 billion a year. We're now over 100 million acres of weed resistance in the U.S., and so many farmers are trying to figure out different ways to address this by reintroducing crop rotation and cover crops and different things that you can do naturally. But Dow Chemical and Monsanto and BASF and others have said, no, what you do is you mix glyphosate with 2,4-D and dicamba, and you have new genetically engineered crops, and you spray all that stuff, and then those weeds will die. But you know, it's just another. And then the weed scientists say, yeah, but now we're going to get a whole new crop of weed resistance. So
and then you get super weeds.
You get
right?
super weeds, and it's just this vicious vicious treadmill.
I thought that putting aside, even if you can put aside the health risks to people, the unsustainability of implied by the growth of these super weeds tells another story about the use of pesticides. It's actually quite terrifying in and of itself.
It is, and there are pollinator impacts, of course, with this that we talk about,
Yeah.
that are very important to food production and soil, the health of the soil. This overuse and this persistent use of these chemicals reduces the microbial community, the beneficial microbes in the soil that plants need.
So one piece of pushback from the industry has always been, but we're feeding the world. We have this altruistic mission to make sure that the world can be fed, and if it weren't for us, there wouldn't be enough food to feed the world. Is there any truth to that argument?
I say no. And there are many different ways to discuss that. I guess the most obvious one is, and the United Nations says this as well. There are lovely reports from the food guru there at the United Nations. If you look around the world at the places where they have food scarcity and real food insecurity, and starvation and all, it's not for lack of pesticides and GMO seeds. It's generally for lack, there's political instability, there's economic instability. A lot of these poor countries that face starvation don't have adequate infrastructure. They don't have a distribution system. They don't have rail and highways and ways to move this and barges, and they don't have refrigeration, and they don't. So there are a lot of factors that go into getting food, growing food, and getting it where it needs to be. And the favorite crop of the GM industry is corn, and we have enough corn. We have over 1 billion bushels of corn every year that we can't do anything with. We don't know what to do with. We can't sell it, can't get people to eat it, we can't feed it to enough livestock, can't get into ethanol. It's called ending stocks in the USDA tracks us. Same with soybeans. So currently we are overproducing the food that most benefits the crowd, that most benefits the companies that are selling the seeds and the pesticides, but doesn't really do much at all to address food insecurity. And then you need, the other aspect is yields. I mean, our National Academy of Sciences has looked at the issue and said, yeah, maybe when you use these seeds and you do all this sort of thing, you get an enhanced yield, a little bit in corn, you don't really get so much in soybeans. It really depends. Depends on where you're growing it, how you're growing it, what the inputs are.
You do argue at the end of the book that if we turn to more sustainable farming practices, it would increase the price of food a little bit. How do you think about that trade-off between short-term costs and long-term costs, and who should bear the brunt of that increased price if that is what results from more sustainable practices?
It's a very complicated answer. Right now, food policy is set to drive production of corn and soybeans and have cheap corn. As I've said, we don't need more corn. What we need is, healthier fruits and vegetables and, ample production, and we need it in a way that is done with healthy soil and fewer pesticides, so we improve the health of our people, we improve the health of our water. We have nitrate runoffs from agriculture in Iowa. The drinking water in Iowa is far above what is considered, it has the nitrates at levels that are considered so very dangerous. So if you move to a system where you're growing crops without a dependence on pesticides, and maybe that means organic, or maybe it just means fewer pesticides, more discriminate use, and you return to a system where you're using things that benefit biodiversity and benefit pollinators, benefit the soil, add nutrients to the crops. If you return to that, maybe it does cost a little bit more during this transition period, but isn't that worth it? And what do we save in terms of healthcare costs and environmental damage? And our National Toxicology Program issued a report in 2016 that said these pesticides and other environmental contaminants are doing so much damage that there is an economic impact. And if we don't want to care about what it's doing to our children, we should, look at the losses that we're going to face in the future with loss of productivity. When you have people, we're losing IQ points in large part because of we're creating this toxic rich environment, this environmental contaminant system, and we have this propaganda telling us you got to have it, you got to feed the world, you got to have it, you got to have it. I make the case in my book that's not true, and the risks,
But
don't necessarily.
we as a society are not good at short-term versus long-term, or about weighing complexity, right?
Right.
So I'm going to open it up to the crowd for questions in a minute. I just wanted to close with one last one for you. There's so many contradictory studies on this that you had to sort through, and you write in the book, for the average individual, reading through scientific research can be daunting, not to mention confusing. And I thought, yes. And what can people do?
Read through the science.
Just read it.
I, as a journalist, I always want the data, and I want the documents, and I want as much as I can get. So I don't pretty much ever believe anything. I just hear from some, trust but verify, that kind of thing. So if you're reading a news article, if you're reading something, look for the original document. People are really good now about providing links to studies and look at that document and look at that study. And if you care about it, look at who the authors are, and then look at who their affiliations are. And maybe you don't have time to do that, but there's a way to get a sense of these things, and arm yourself with education so that you can have the context and have the perspective as you take in the information.
That makes a ton of sense. That's good advice. Questions? I figured would have a lot. Let's see. How do we want to handle this? Do you want to run around with a microphone? Yeah. So let's start right there. There you go.
I'm willing to acknowledge and accept your point that pesticides in overly high levels is a carcinogen. Longevity is a carcinogen too. When people live longer, they are more prone to getting cancer. You mentioned the paraquat comparison of glyphosate replacing that. I'm curious, would you be willing to accept the idea that a replacement pesticide can be far safer than a prior one and still add some value, and that through innovation we can create pesticides, that it's an ongoing learning process of improvement?
So I think what I said with that it was much better than paraquat, that it was an improvement over paraquat. It didn't replace paraquat. Many farmers still do use paraquat it's a burn down. They generally use it for burn down. They cannot spray it directly over crops like glyphosate. They can't use it to a certain extent. But yes, to that point, it was definitely a benefit and advancement over paraquat and could protect farmers on an acute basis. In terms of innovation of pesticides, what's happening right now, the companies themselves have realized this is not sustainable. This treadmill is not going to go on for another 20 or 30 or 40 years. So Monsanto and BASF and Dow and these guys, and Bayer, who owns Monsanto, are pursuing what they call biopesticides. And right now, they're more of a combination of biological ingredients, which they get from fungi or bacteria that occur in the soil naturally. And the idea is that these naturally occurring organisms have the ability to fight weeds and fight bugs. And they're trying to capture that and use that. And so these are going to be biological pesticides. And Monsanto's investing a lot of money in that thing. And the EPA has set up a fast track to try to get these sorts of things approved on a faster basis, because the EPA realizes it's not sustainable over the long run.
But still milk the money they can get out of these old brands as long as they can?
As long as they can, because they don't have, there hasn't been a blockbuster biopesticide come out yet. But they're working on them.
Thank you.
Let's see. How about right there?
Hi. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, recently there was a court case where someone who worked on a farm that dealt with glyphosate, they sued Monsanto and he won. Do you think that this is the beginning of more cases like this popping up? Or do you think that Monsanto's learning how to get better at fighting these?
So that's Lee Johnson, and he wasn't a farm worker. He was a groundskeeper at the Benicia School District in California, Northern California. He's 47 now. He is expected not to live very much longer. He has this very bizarre form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma that manifests in skin lesions all over his entire body, and he's in a great deal of pain. And his case was the first to go to trial, right, in California, in San Francisco. And the jury found unanimously after 6 weeks of trial or so that Monsanto should take the blame. They found that the Roundup, it was Ranger Pro and Roundup that he was using. So it's not glyphosate. We didn't even get into that. We should probably talk about that. But found that it contributed to his cancer. The legal world is it has to be a substantial contributor. They didn't say it was the sole cause, but it was a substantial contributor to his cancer. And they found that, and they found that Monsanto had hidden the risks, that Monsanto was liable for malicious conduct because it had known about the risks and hidden the risks. And so they awarded him $289 million, which caused the shares in Bayer, Monsanto's new owners, to tank and investors to set their hair on fire. Monsanto appealed that to the judge immediately and asked for her to set aside the verdict because those crazy jurors don't know what they're doing. The judge did not do that, but she did reduce the award to $78 million. And Monsanto is now, this is a long answer, you didn't want this, I know. Monsanto is now, Monsanto's appealing that $78 million, and Lee Johnson is cross-appealing for the whole $289. So that's where that stands. The answer to your question is there are about 10,000 other people who have also sued. The next trial is set for February 25th, and that's in federal court. And then there's another one March 18th, and that's back in state court. So, yes, and Bayer has lost about 30 billion euros in shareholder value because of this.
And does that first trial set a precedent, do you think?
Well, I mean, it certainly woke up, some people who were watching what this next trial is going to be completely different because it's in federal court. Bayer said, to heck with those Monsanto attorneys, we're bringing our own folks in who've defended us on pharmaceutical issues, mass tort lawsuits. So they've got a power team of lawyers, and they convinced the judge to bifurcate the trial so that the jurors in the first part of the trial will not be allowed to hear any information or evidence about Monsanto's conduct. No evidence about manipulating scientific studies or colluding with regulators or anything like that. It will all be, just looking at science and causation issues.
Before we go to the next question, do you want to pause on that point about Roundup and glyphosate?
Yeah.
It seems it's an important...
It is an important point. Glyphosate is one ingredient. It's the active ingredient, but no one who uses Roundup is, you're not using glyphosate alone. You're using a formulated product. And there are surfactants in the formulated products. And what most scientists who've looked at this have found is that the formulated product is more toxic than glyphosate by itself, that this interaction with the surfactant and the way that it helps the glyphosate get into the system is a problem. One of the main surfactants that Monsanto has been using for years, POEA, was banned in Europe because of concerns there. But that's, there's a very big distinction. And the lawsuits, none of the lawsuits allege that glyphosate was responsible. They allege that these specific products.
These specific formulations of it.
Specific formulations, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's see, how about all the way back in the corner since you're there?
Yeah, hi, thank you. I had a question. You spoke earlier about the EPA testing limits in chemicals in foods. What rate or how frequently does the EPA find foods in excess of those chemical limits, and what sanctions have food producers or farmers been faced because of the excessive limits?
Well, so the legal levels, what they call the legal levels, the percentages, I have a lovely chart when I do PowerPoints, it's very small. The amount that they find, like generally less than 10% of the foods that they'll sample will have levels that exceed what they call legal levels. Now, I've seen through Freedom of Information, you see some conversations inside the regulatory bodies where they're really discussing and working pretty hard to figure out how to not report legal level, violations of some things. There's a lot of things they don't report that you only see through these internal documents. But if you believe that what they say, that this level, anything below it is safe, that's only a very small percentage of foods that exceed that, or percentage of foods that are sampled by our government that exceed that. But of course, the worrisome thing, is like chlorpyrifos. They told us for a long time there were certain levels that as long as we were under that, we were fine. And now they're kind of like, oh, well, sorry,
It seems like
I guess we were wrong.
That's the key question, how much faith you can have in those levels that are
But-
set, the process by which they're set as
Yeah.
well, right?
But what sanctions or fines do the food producers face when they are in excess?
They're supposed to be pulled from the market and they're supposed to be sanctioned, but I don't have that information. It hasn't been made available. I haven't been able to get it.
Okay, let's see, there's a question all the way over here in the back.
You mentioned Monsanto being bought by a new owner. My question is, given the scope of Monsanto's involvement in the United States food system, are there any concerns like national security or anything you think is related now that it's been sold to a foreign entity?
Well, that you see that there's so much consolidation, international consolidation. Syngenta and ChemChina got together, Dow and DuPont, and Monsanto and Bayer. So it's quite common, and they've been approved by regulatory agencies around the world. These mergers have been by, the justice departments and things. So the main consideration, the main worry that farmers have and others is that this consolidation, of course, puts so much control of seeds and chemicals into, such a few hands that you're going to see limited choices and higher prices. And, that's the issue with all sorts of corporate consolidation. So that seems to be the main concern in terms of, Germany stealing our technology or something. I think we're more concerned about China than about.
What did you hear, before we go back to the crowd, what did you hear from farmers? What was their was there a consistent reaction? Were they scared to these concerns about
cancer?
About cancer, about other potential problems from pesticides? Were they a total mix of people who were believers and people who were skeptics?
Yeah, I mean, if I talk to lots and lots of farmers, if they have cancer or they know someone or their family member has cancer or their neighbor, they're really concerned about it, right? If they don't, they're not so much. They're more concerned about the fact that it doesn't work like it used to work, and they're having to now till their fields again, or they're having to use more and spend more money to use more. They're having to, employ different strategies. So most of the farmers now that I talk to, they say, yeah, maybe, like that's this nagging thing in their back of the mind. But when you're a farmer and you use pesticides, you kind of already know that. I mean, pesticides are dangerous for humans. That's known. Our government tracks this through something called the Agricultural Health Study, and they track about 80,000 farm families in North Carolina and Iowa for different diseases to look at, and they've been doing this since the early 1990s. And they do this specifically because they know these people are most exposed to pesticides and they want to see the impacts. And so there are a number of studies up on the Agricultural Health Study website, which again, it's sponsored by our National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and EPA, and you can see all the ties to prostate cancer and liver disease and Alzheimer's and non-Hodgkin lymphoma from all these different pesticides.
Interesting. We had another question back there somewhere. Yep, there it is.
Yes, thank you so much for writing the book.
Thank
But
you.
also, I'd love you to talk about the element of antibiotics in glyphosate.
So there was a patent on glyphosate as an antibiotic. It's also, used as a chelator. So there are a number of concerns about what that antibiotic, component of this might do, both to the soil, and to the human body. There are a number of, there's sort of emerging science now. It's still pretty new, so I don't hang on to it. I like to have stuff that's got some weight and been repeated. And but what this is doing maybe to the gut microbial community in our gut, that it could be essentially killing it, and this is what antibiotics do. Of course, if you're taking antibiotics and they kill off a lot of the germs and the microbes in there. So there's concern that you're interfering with the gut microbiome, and when you do that, everything can get out of whack. you know, I mean, that has to do with the health throughout our system. So there's some real concerns about that, and there's some scientists, including one at MIT, that have published some research on that.
Interesting. Another couple more back there.
Hi, I'm curious how you were able to get your hands on internal documents from Monsanto. I assume that Freedom of Information Act only gets you government documents.
Right. I mean, that was easy. That part was not hard. I mean, some of them I got through EPA because you can see EPA talking to Monsanto. So I've got a lot of that. But when the lawsuits were filed and the attorneys said about discovery, Monsanto had to turn over to the plaintiff's attorneys about 10 million pages of internal documents, and they are still turning over more. And even though they've asked for those to be sealed from public view, many of them are not sealed. And so I spend a lot of time trolling through court documents, just like an inordinate amount of time, ridiculous amount of time.
But then you find that one wonderful thing, and it makes all the reading worth it, right?
Yeah.
There were a couple more questions back there, and then there's one up here, too. Yeah, great.
I'm wondering how much you've gotten into the issues of pollinators and monarch butterflies and what those farmers you were talking to think about all of that.
Yeah. Well, again, you know, it depends on what they're growing and where they are and, you know, what they need. If they're pollinators have been impacted, and pollinators, of course, are you know, birds and butterflies and bees, of course, and that go from plant to plant and you know, pollinate. And bees in particular are so important because, you know, they are responsible for pollinating roughly 30% of our food supply. And we've seen a real decline in the bee population, and that is tied some people have tied it, some scientists have tied it to glyphosate, others have tied it more to neonicotinoids, which is a class of insecticides that have been used. Monarch butterfly decline, we've also seen that, pretty significant decline in the monarch, and that has been largely attributed to glyphosate because of there's such widespread use of glyphosate that the milkweed plants and the things that these young monarch, you know, larvae rely on as nutrition have been wiped out, are essentially being wiped out. And Monsanto has acknowledged that to a certain degree, and they've set up a pollinator program, and they've donated some money, and you know, they're trying to encourage people to help the monarch come back.
Right.
But it is evidence again that we're messing with our world. You know, we're impacting very necessary biodiversity.
I was struck by that in your book. Why is it that Monsanto acknowledges the monarch butterfly problem and the role of glyphosate in that? It's just too undeniable?
It's just too undeniable, I think. And it's good stewardship to do that, you know,
Right.
to try to come forward and say yes. And they have, you know, acknowledged, they've had to come forward and acknowledge weed resistance problems.
Right. Right. Let's see, there's one back there, I think, who's been waiting for a while. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, suppose that this chemical was banned tomorrow. What would the cost be to Monsanto? What would the cost be to the U.S. economy? What would the replacement be in that plan that might motivate Monsanto's response as well as be the next step for moving on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of how it would impact Monsanto, I mean, roughly before they were bought by Bayer and their revenues and profits were reported publicly, and they were just bought, you know, last summer at close, but roughly $3 billion a year tied to glyphosate products. So, you know, and they're only one company, there are many others. They're one of the biggest manufacturers and distributors. So it's billions a year that they would lose if this product went away. You know, many farmers say, oh my gosh, we can't grow crops without glyphosate. We can't do it. Well, of course, they were growing crops before glyphosate. It hasn't been around since the dawn of man. It's been around since the mid-'70s. There are tried and true practices that farmers have used to suppress and reduce weed pressure on crops. And there are many, many farmers in the U.S. who do that right now and don't use glyphosate, and many in Europe and many around the world who do that. So it can be done. But if you're a farmer who's set up your entire system that way, and you don't rotate your crops, and you want to just grow corn after corn after corn, or wheat, and you want to desiccate your wheat, we haven't talked about that, but and you don't want to change your system, and you don't want to change the way you're doing, it's going to be really hard, because it's not an easy thing. And I write about that in the book too. Transitioning to a new system, a new paradigm is not easy, and it's not going to be easy. But there are farmers who are doing it. There are food companies who are encouraging farmers to do it. There are new distribution systems that are being funded and set up because they see the future and they see what we're doing now is not sustainable. It's just really a question of how fast do we get there, and how much harm do we allow to happen in the meantime.
So I think we have time for a couple more questions. Let's see, there's one all the way over there in the back. I know you've been waiting for a while.
Now that you've published your book, what part of this issue will you be focusing on, or will you be moving on to a new issue?
I wish I could.
This is your life now.
I know. I'm pretty passionate about, when you spend 20 years, I'm just very passionate about food and farming and agriculture. So I'm spending time with a lot of farmers right now. They call themselves the Idea Network farmers, and they're trying to do exactly this. Like, they have USDA money, and they're trying to figure out what can we do? What are the different strategies? How do we do this to grow more with less? And they are coming up with some really cool things. So I'm not going to jump into fluoride or cell phone radiation, or my dad really wants me to jump into climate change. But I think pesticides are my issue. And as I said, I think what we eat and how we grow this food and what we feed our children is so very important.
There was a quote in your book, actually, I was thinking about from a doctor who said, "We are convinced there's more than ample science to raise serious concerns over rising herbicide use and exposure, yet not nearly enough is being done to either dismiss such concerns or study them in a meaningful way. People think global warming is the biggest threat, but it's not. This is." I thought it was a thought-provoking quote on the subject of your father's desire to have you cover climate change.
Entirely.
I'm sure he would.
And, I don't know. People ask me that too. Well, which is bigger, global warming? I think they're all big, and they're all important issues.
That's a provocative quote. So we have time for one more question. Let's see. Let's go right up here.
Can you talk a bit about the desiccation of the wheat crop?
Yes.
Did everybody hear the desiccation of the wheat crop?
Yeah, I'm just interested to hear what your thoughts about using glyphosate to desiccate wheat before harvesting.
Does everybody know what desiccation is and means? Nerdy.
Nerdy is all good.
So Monsanto has encouraged farmers, so even if you don't have a genetically engineered crop that will allow you to spray it and it won't die, but the weeds will, even if you don't have that kind of crop, Monsanto has come up with some really nifty marketing materials to encourage farmers to desiccate. And what that means is shortly before you're ready to harvest, when you're ready to harvest, when the grain is mature and everything is ready, then you spray it with Roundup. Or Ranger Pro or whatever glyphosate-based thing you have. And the plant will then die. The grain is mature. The plant will die, will dry out, get all brown or whatever color it's going to get. And then you can just go in and harvest. And so if one part of your field gets ready earlier than another, or if you have damp conditions that's not drying out, because your crop has to be dry and certain standards for harvesting. So you can just spray this glyphosate right on it and it'll kill the plant. That's called desiccation. And what that does, though, is it leaves pretty high levels because your crop is mature, and there you go. And they use it a lot on oats in particular. In Canada, we get a lot of our oats in the US. We import a lot from Canada. They use it a lot on wheat. They use it in barley, things like that. So it's a pretty controversial practice because we know it leaves such high levels and we know it's not necessary. It's sort of a cheat. And so several grain handling companies just in the last year or two are starting to put language into their contracts with farmers saying, we won't take your grain if you desiccate it. So that is the movement on that front.
So we've probably got time for one more. Let's see. You can just yell if you want to, although your mic is coming.
So I'm a medical student, and so I'm curious. You mentioned the cancer studies with the WHO and the quote from the doctor right there. But I guess I would expect, or at least hope, that there would be a bigger backlash from the medical community. And so, we've talked about the Monsanto's influence over the EPA and FDA, but I'm wondering what Monsanto's level of influence is over the medical field more broadly, especially now, with this, with the acquisition from Bayer, exactly.
Yeah. You don't see as much of that. I mean, a lot of doctors and medical scientists from Harvard and from Boston College and from Mount Sinai and from UCSF and others, and that's just in the United States, have put their name on papers and come out publicly, and said, this is a problem, this looks like it causes cancer or other problems. So medical professionals are speaking up, and there's over 100 that put their name on a paper in support of IARC and that sort of thing. I haven't seen as much control over the medical community by Monsanto as you see in the academic community.
So on that somewhat encouraging note, we will say goodnight for now. Thank you all so much for coming out.
Thank you.
If you haven't read Carey's book, I highly encourage you to do so. It's readable and important. So congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thank you.